Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sudip Parikh, and I have the privilege of serving as the Chief Executive Officer of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and Executive Publisher of Science Magazine and the Science Family of Journals. Thank you so much for joining us today for the 2020 Charles Valentine Riley Memorial Lecture. I wish we were meeting in person. I know we've all gotten used to being able to have these gatherings virtually. I just want to put on the record, I hate it. I can't wait to see you all in person. But until that time, we're going to have to do it this way. Hopefully everyone can stay safe and be well. And so with that, it's my honor to welcome you to the lecture today, along with our honoree and lecturer, Dr. Evan H. DeLucia, our esteemed moderator, 2020 World Food Prize laureate, Dr. Rattan Lal, and the complement of distinguished panelists you're going to meet later on today. AAAS is the world's largest multidisciplinary scientific society, and we're also a leading publisher of cutting-edge research. We were founded in 1848, over 170 years ago, and AAAS since that time has been seeking to advance science, engineering, and innovation throughout the world for the benefit of all people. Or to put it really simply, we want to advance science and serve society. The theme of today's program is the transformation of global food systems to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And I can't really think of any challenge, I can't think of no other challenge for which the benefits of science, engineering, and innovation are more urgently needed. Climate change is a global threat. It has unprecedented scale, and it's going to require the combined efforts of scientists, governments, and all sectors of the global economy to address it. Agriculture and food systems account for roughly 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. As was highlighted in a new report in Science Magazine, a shameless plug from just 2 weeks ago, we simply won't be able to prevent the worst impacts of climate change without addressing food systems. But that report also laid out 5 strategies that, if implemented together over the next 30 years, could result in net negative GHG emissions. These kinds of changes won't be easy, and they're going to require everyone across the food system to be engaged. But I think we all know that business as usual is just not an option. Earlier this week, an uncommon alliance of food, farming, and environmental groups, from the American Farm Bureau Federation to the Environmental Defense Fund, came together to promote a series of shared climate policy recommendations. You know, it's this kind of effort, this kind of broad spectrum effort to break through historical barriers that are going to be necessary to address these challenges. And while the size of the challenge requires bold solutions at a global scale, we can't overlook the real human impacts. As just one example, US households in the lowest income quintile, earning an average of just over $12,000 a year, spend more than 40% of their income on food. How do we build new food systems that address global climate change without leaving these people or the smallholder farmers that are at the base of many global food supply chains even further behind? Our challenge is to build climate-friendly systems that are also more just and more equitable. This is not going to be easy, and I think we all know that. I know we're all eager to hear the thoughts of our honoree and the panelists on these and other questions, but I want to take a few minutes just to thank our partners in this endeavor. First, I'd like to thank Kathy Witecki, President of the Charles Valentine Riley Memorial Foundation, which is committed to promoting a broader and more complete understanding of agriculture and to building upon Charles Valentine Riley's legacy as a whole picture person with a vision for enhancing agriculture through scientific knowledge. I'm sure that Charles Riley, who was appointed chief entomologist at the US Department of Agriculture in 1878, he'd probably find the challenges that we're facing today unfamiliar, and the potential technological solutions that we're talking about here unimaginable. But I also know that he would recognize the spirit of scientific innovation, and again, that goal of advancing science in service to society. This lecture also builds on a long history of association between AAAS and Mr. Riley. He happened to serve as our vice president for our biology section in 1888. Our shared mission of promoting science and innovation to benefit all people is just as strong today as it was then. And we're proud to have the Charles Valentine Riley Memorial Foundation as a partner. I'd also like to thank Barbara Stinson, president of the World Food Prize Foundation, our other partner in this lecture. The World Food Prize Foundation's fundamental goal is to support efforts toward an adequate supply and availability of nutritious food for the growing world population in the 21st century. And we are delighted, absolutely delighted to have Dr. Rattan Lal, the 2020 World Food Prize laureate, on our program today. And so with that, it's my honor to introduce this year's lecturer, Dr. Evan DeLucia. Dr. DeLucia is the G. William Ahrens Professor of Integrative Biology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He was also the founding director of the program in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and has been the director of the School of Integrative Biology of the Institute for Sustainability, Energy, and Environment, and of the Center for Advanced Bioenergy and Bioproducts Innovation. That's a mouthful. Dr. DeLucia's remarks, entitled Rethinking American Agriculture, Reducing Greenhouse Gas Emissions from Food Production, will explore how land use and management affect the exchange of greenhouse gases between crop systems and the atmosphere, and how we can use different agricultural practices to bolster the farm economy and mitigate climate change. Following Dr. DeLucia's remarks, there will be a moderated discussion among Dr. DeLucia and our distinguished panelists, who Dr. Witecki will introduce later, and an open Q&A session. So be ready for that. So once again, thank you all for being here today, even though it is virtually. And I hope that we can all see each other in person soon. And I know that we will want to celebrate Dr. DeLucia. So welcome, Dr. DeLucia, and I look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much for your kind words, Dr. Parikh. And I want to reiterate the thanks to Kathy and the Riley Memorial Fund, the World Food Prize, and AAAS for giving me this opportunity to talk to you today. Just give me a second. Let me get my screen sharing going, and we can get started. Okay, I think we're good. Hopefully you're seeing the beginning of my presentation. So I want to jump right into it with you today, and just start with this image. I'm giving this lecture from my office at the University of Illinois. Came here, I had a little bit of bandwidth in my home internet. And I was walking in today. It's a spectacularly beautiful day here in Central Illinois, blue sky. And as I looked up at that blue sky, even though I've been in this business for quite a long time, it's almost inconceivable to me that human activity can change the composition of the atmosphere. Looking at that blue sky, it just seems so infinite and vast. But when I look at this gorgeous picture of the blue marble of Earth from space, it's very clear that our atmosphere is thin and a little less clear, but it evokes a sense of vulnerability to me. And in fact, we know that since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we've pumped well north of 400 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And that's resulted, that and other greenhouse gases, has resulted in a really unprecedented rate of warming of our planetary system. Just from a CO2 perspective, before the Industrial Revolution, we were about 280 parts per million. It had been that way for over 800,000 years, almost 900,000 years prior to that. And now we're north of 410 parts per million. Again, this greenhouse gas is fueling a very unprecedented rate of global warming. And this gas is coming from the combustion primarily of fossil fuels. But it's not just the combustion of fossil fuels, it's how we use land that influences the atmosphere. And I want to just spend a few minutes talking about how land use change, and agriculture, of course, is a major land use change, influences the composition of the atmosphere. If you think about harvesting or cutting down a rainforest in Brazil to make room for new soybean plantations, or if you think about planting trees on abandoned pasture in New England, this dramatically influences how land influences the composition of the atmosphere. On one side of the equation, there are physical effects, biophysical effects. As you change from one vegetation type to another vegetation type, you influence the amount of solar radiation that's reflected, albedo, or absorbed by the Earth's surface. And of course, different types of plants and different types of land surfaces lose water by transpiration or evaporation from the land surface in different ways, influencing cooling of the Earth's surface. But I want to focus mostly today on the left side of this figure, the biogeochemical side. There's CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. That's kind of the holy trinity of greenhouse gases. And of course, those are the gases that are increasing very dramatically in the atmosphere from the combustion of fossil fuels and how we use land. And they're the ones driving the unprecedented rate of global change and warming, planetary warming that we're seeing right now. Carbon dioxide is taken up by ecosystems on the Earth's surface by the process of photosynthesis, and it's released back. At least some of it is released back through plant respiration, and probably most importantly for this talk, by respiration from microorganisms in the soil. Methane is also produced in wetlands globally. A very dominant production of methane now, biogenic methane, is coming from enteric fermentation from livestock. I'm going to touch on that a little bit. And of course, the nitrogen fertilizer we use to meet the challenges of growing a crop for an ever-increasing human population, some of that nitrogen fertilizer in the soil is converted by microorganisms to nitrous oxide, another very potent greenhouse gas. So how we use land, particularly in our cropping systems, very much influences these processes. Now let's think about our cropping systems for a minute. When we look globally, well north of 80% of our arable land on the planet is in these four crops: corn, wheat, soybean, and rice. And over much of the land that these crops are planted, they are very intensely managed. They're used very high inputs of nitrogenous fertilizer and other types of fertilizers, conventional cultivation techniques which disturb the soil. So we really are, this is a very a high impact system over much of the regions where we're growing these four crops. And indeed, as Sudeep said a few minutes ago, this is greatly increasing the emission of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And most of that's coming from altering biogeochemistry rather than the fossil fuel consumption of actual farming operations. Although the fossil fuels that are used to produce nitrogen fertilizers are quite high. There's quite a bit of uncertainty in the estimates. Estimates of emissions from our food production systems typically range from 20% to north of 30%. We're kind of settling in on about 30% now. So 30% of global emissions to the atmosphere are coming from our food production system. Some of that before the farm gate, how we manage crops on the landscape. Some of it after the farm gate, how we transport and process those foodstuffs. So it's quite clear from this that we are not going to be able to solve the challenge of climate change without addressing emissions from our agricultural systems. So we're asking an awful lot from our agricultural systems. Feed an ever-growing human population, do it by greatly reducing emissions of greenhouse gases. And as I'm going to touch on at the very end, we're even looking to our agricultural systems as a system for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It's a very, very heavy lift. So where are these emissions coming from? There's no real surprise here. If you look at emissions globally, and this is emissions of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane coming from drainage of peatlands, nitrous oxide coming from fertilizer applications in the developed world, in the Western world, but also in the rapidly developing Eastern world, in Asia. Nitrous oxide emissions very high, methanogens, methane production from livestock very high. And I'm going to show you now livestock production. It's essentially a mirror of this image. If you look globally at biogenic methane from cattle, primarily from cattle, from enteric fermentation, it's kind of a mirror image. So this is the source globally of this 30% of our global emissions that's coming from agriculture, developed Western world and the rapidly developing Eastern world. As we become more affluent globally, the demand for meat products goes up. methane production, of course, goes up in accord with that increase in demand for meat. Well, I want to take you a little closer to home now and think about the United States and the greater Midwest in particular. Think back to the old days when we used to fly. When we used to fly, for those of you that didn't sit in the aisle seat and actually chose to sit in the window seat, when you crossed the greater Midwest and looked out the window, this is kind of what you saw. And oops, sorry about that. It's 90 million acres of corn and almost that much in soybean. So a big chunk of the United States, as a matter of fact, the single largest biome in the United States is in the corn bean rotation. This is kind of terrible from a biodiversity perspective. Now, don't get me wrong, this is an enormous benefit economically, and it's feeding the planet. But from an environmental perspective, we have a species richness of 2, corn and beans. And this system is, because it's managed in typically very conventional ways with high inputs, is an enormous producer of greenhouse gases. Now, can we think about this system a little differently? So how's corn being used in the United States? It turns out that 40% of that corn crop currently is being used for ethanol production or fuel. We use it to drive. Another 40% is used as a feedstock for feeding cattle, pigs, and chickens. So almost none of this is used for direct human consumption. Well, let's think of that 40% that we're using for ethanol production right now. Are there alternatives, lower impact alternatives for generating fuel in a carbon neutral or even a carbon beneficial way that we could displace that intensive maize, that 40% of that maize cropping system that's currently going to ethanol production? And the answer is an emphatic yes. If we think about putting high yielding perennial crops on the landscape, crops like miscanthus, shown green here in the foreground, or a native prairie species, switchgrass, or even assemblages that look like prairie, multi-species assemblages, they can produce enormous quantities of biomass that would help us displace the ethanol that's coming from the annual high input maize ecosystem. And that would have enormous impact on the greenhouse gas emissions from our current agricultural systems. So I want to share with you some data that we've been collecting in our laboratory and with our colleagues, showing what the impacts can be of this transition of our fuel production system that's currently 40% of our corn production. But before I do that, I want to kind of geek out a little bit and show you a method that I think has been transformative. And this is a technique called the eddy covariance method. This technique's been around for quite a long time, but it has really transformed the ecology of agricultural systems in the last 20 years. And it's a technique where we put very sensitive, fast sensors above the crop. We hold it above whatever crop we want on a tower or a platform, and we can measure the exchange of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, water vapor, heat and energy between the atmosphere and the land surface, and we can do it really fast, multiple times a second. But the really important thing about this technique from the perspective of studying the ecology of agriculture is we can do it at the farm scale. We don't have to do it in a pot. We don't have to do it in a small plot. We can do it over tens and hundreds of acres at a time. So we can get realistic management practices and use this technique to monitor the exchange of greenhouse gases with the atmosphere. Well, let me take a second and show you some data. So this is data that was collected by Caitlin Moore and Carl Bernanke at the University of Illinois and others. Carl's also with the U.S. Department of, his primary appointments with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And this is net ecosystem carbon balance. So the way to think about these numbers are, this is if you add up in a year, all of the carbon coming into an ecosystem by the process of photosynthesis. Subtract from that all of the carbon that's being re-emitted to the atmosphere by the process of plant respiration and soil respiration. And then further subtract from that the amount of carbon that's carried off-site in corn and beans by removal of grain, and for the bioenergy crops, the removal of biomass. That's the net ecosystem carbon balance. That is the amount of carbon that should be accumulating in the soil or being lost from the soil from a given piece of land every year. These data represent, the pink lines represent the maize, soy, the corn, soy rotation. And the other colored lines represent some perennial biofuel feedstocks, miscanthus, switchgrass, and prairie. And the convention here is up, positive values mean loss of carbon to the atmosphere, and down means accumulation of carbon from the atmosphere down into the Earth's ecosystem. And I think what I can convince you with this data set is conventional high input soybean and maize tillage systems are a net loss of carbon to the atmosphere. Where's that carbon coming from? Microorganisms, as they're tilled and oxygenated, are metabolizing stores of soil organic carbon that have accumulated over thousands of years and losing that to the atmosphere. In contrast, the perennial agricultural system is storing carbon deep in the soil over time, rebuilding those stores of soil organic carbon. So you can see how perennialism in particular and these bioenergy feedstocks can actually rebuild soil organic carbon, the nutritional quality of the soil, but also sequester carbon in the soil. And in fact, this is some modeling output from a colleague, Sarah Davis at Ohio University. In fact, if you were to add up methane production, most of our Midwest agricultural systems are more or less neutral for methane. But if you were to add up methane production, nitrous oxide production, and carbon dioxide production, put them all on a carbon equivalent basis, and ask the question, what would the conversion of 40% of our corn ethanol system, what effect would it have for the entire rain-fed Midwest if we converted that 40% of corn into 40% of perennial feedstocks? And here's what the modeling exercise tells us would happen. In the top left, A, that's our current agricultural practices. And that salmon color is telling us that the rain-fed Midwest under current agricultural practices is a net loser of greenhouse gases, emitter of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. If we were to convert that 40% of land that currently goes to corn ethanol to miscanthus, for example, B, we would convert the entire Midwest from a net source of greenhouse gases to a net sink of greenhouse gases. So that's one way that changing the types of crops, particularly perennials on the landscape, and it doesn't need to be perennials for fuel production. It can be kernza, it can be perennial legumes. There's a whole number of different types of perennial systems we could put on the landscape that would have a dramatically positive effect on greenhouse gas emissions. But you don't have to change species to actually improve the climate change balance for our agricultural system. This is also some data from my friend and colleague Carl Bernanke, a USDA scientist. And this shows that net ecosystem exchange from eddy covariance data, NEE down here at the bottom, over many years of the corn soybean system. But this is a no-till agricultural system. And what you can see is net NEE, the amount of carbon coming into the system, is consistently negative in the no-till agricultural system. And if you subtract out the amount of grain that's lost in the system, that's removed every year, it's less negative, but still negative. And if you further subtract out the amount of fossil fuels that are burned, that's that little line, the fossil fuels that are burned in tractors to harvest that, it still becomes a little less negative, but it's still very strongly negative. So just changing to no-till systems, which are not very commonly used here in the rain-fed Midwest, would greatly increase the amount of carbon that's removed from the atmosphere, in addition to a whole host of other benefits, but just from a greenhouse gas perspective would greatly improve the climate change contributions of our agricultural systems. Now, what if we just kind of explode the whole system and just think completely differently about agriculture? So we've got a system now on the rain-fed Midwest that is a corn bean system. I'm not talking a lot about biodiversity today, but another critical challenge. Very low biodiversity, very high input system. What if we think about What if we think about a very diverse agricultural system? Okay, and this is, agroforestry systems have been around for a long time. This beautiful picture is a woody polyculture system where trees are grown with herbaceous crops in between, animals are grazed in between, a very diverse food production system. This kind of production system stores a lot of carbon because inputs typically are very low. Nitrogen inputs are very low. They tend to have a very tight nitrogen biogeochemistry. They don't lose a lot of nitrous oxide to the air. They don't lose a lot of nitrate to groundwater. In a typical agroforestry system that we've studied for quite a long time, the trees are growing for wood. But we can think a little bit differently about trees. Trees produce food too. Trees produce nuts and berries. Okay, I can feel eyebrows being raised out there on this Zoom call. Who's going to eat a lot of nuts and berries? But I would ask you to think a little differently about our corn bean production system. As I mentioned before, not a lot of that soybean is edamame. Not a lot of that soybean is directly consumed by humans. So our current corn bean system is really not a food production system per se in terms of direct human consumption. But if you look at this graph, this is the nutritional composition of corn on the left and soybean to the right. What we're really producing in this system is a feedstock or two feedstocks for producing carbohydrates, proteins, and oils. Carbohydrates and proteins from the corn system, oils and proteins from the soybean system. Look at chestnut and hazelnut, fantastic producers of carbohydrates, proteins, and oils. So these trees are actually fungible with the current corn-soybean system, with one major question that needs to be answered, and that is, can we produce enough carbohydrate, protein, and oil if we were to shift to this current agricultural system? And the answer to that is maybe, actually a promising maybe. This is some modeling work done from Kevin Waltz, who's currently the director of the Savannah Institute. And it shows that after an establishment period, if you were to plant a system of chestnut, hazelnut, currant, and cattle on that landscape, you would be producing enough calories per hectare to basically be equivalent to roughly half of our current maize soybean system. That's not too shabby. Halfway there, you're halfway there with a system that has not had its management practices optimized and has not had the benefit of a green revolution in terms of improved crop genetics. So these are largely unimproved crops. So it's entirely possible that we could take this highly diversified system and scale it to the level of production that we're currently benefiting from our current corn and soybean systems. All right, what I want to do now is just shift gears a little bit from plant-based systems to meat-based systems and food production. It's what time is it here in Illinois? It's 1 o'clock, so it's about lunchtime. Some of you are looking at this beautiful picture and saying, "What gorgeous animals!" And we've got a native pasture in the foreground that's in flower. A gorgeous picture. Lunchtime, some of you are looking at this picture and going, food, steaks and burgers walking around. When I look at this picture, I look at methane producers. Enteric methane production from cattle is a huge challenge for our climate system. But it's not just the methane that's produced from cattle. It's what cattle do to the landscape and what the landscape does in terms of producing carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane that also contributes. And that's what I want to talk about just for a few minutes. We've used fire for millennia to manage pastures and to manage grazing lands. Now, the traditional way of using fire is to burn a paddock, a pasture, to burn it uniformly, and then to put livestock on that paddock or pasture at a very high grazing intensity, but a uniform grazing intensity. Uniform fire, uniform grazing intensity. Turns out that's not the way nature really works very well. The way nature works is fire is very patchy on the landscape. It burns intensely here, not so intensely there. Livestock do not graze, although they graze in nature very intensely. They don't tend to graze uniformly across a paddock or landscape. They tend to cluster in groups. So what if we were to transition our management of cattle from uniform treatment of the pasture by fire and uniform treatment of where cattle graze to a very patchy system that is more quote, natural? It turns out that patch burn grazing, where you're burning patches, is a very effective tool in managing, and adaptive multi-paddock grazing, where cattle are moved in very intense groups from one location to another location, is enormously beneficial to the environment because it gives the patch that has been used a longer rest period between grazing. And we've been conducting some research at Archibald Biologic Station in Florida. And I wanted to share with you these are early data from those experiments. The left side, FBG, this is greenhouse gas carbon dioxide emission from that eddy covariance technique for a uniformly burned field. The right side, PBG, that's patch burned grazing, data for patch burned grazing. And this is eddy flux data for time of year and time of day. Warm colors, the oranges and yellows, represent a net loss of carbon to the atmosphere, and the blues and greens represent a net uptake of carbon from the atmosphere into the land surface. And I hope I can convince you with this data set that there's more blue and green on the PBG side than there is on the traditional conventional side, the FBG side. So as we mimic nature in terms of the diversity of the way we manage our landscape, mimic its patchiness, both in grazing and in how we burn that landscape, we can reduce the emission of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. Okay, so I've been talking about a different view of agriculture that will reduce emissions to the atmosphere. And we know that if we're going to solve the climate change problem, how we manage our food production systems has got to be a big piece of that solution. We're faced, of course, with feeding an ever-growing human population, and we've got to ask even more of agriculture. And the reason I say that is every carbon molecule of carbon dioxide in particular, that we emit today is going to be around for 80, 90 years. So even if we were incredibly aggressive and brought our carbon emissions from fossil fuel consumption to zero today, and we were able to net out, reduce all emissions from our agricultural system, we'd still have a climate change problem. Because we have to come up with ways to reducing that carbon dioxide that's long lived in the atmosphere and pull it down. And so something we don't often talk about are carbon dioxide removal strategies. And these strategies go from whimsical to practical and everything in between, but we've got to start taking them seriously pretty quickly. One carbon dioxide removal strategy that I'm sure you're all familiar with is in the center top. That is reforestation and afforestation. Trees are great carbon dioxide consumers. So getting more trees on the landscape would be a wonderful thing. On the top left is BECCS, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. This is where you would grow a plant like miscanthus or switchgrass as an energy feedstock, and then combust that to produce electricity, then capture the flue gas, which is not too hard to do, and then pump it down below ground into geologic stores. So that's another alternative scenario. One scenario that we've gotten very interested in my laboratory is the middle right, enhanced weathering, because it's a system that we already do. We already do in a kind of similar way on agricultural landscapes. Let me talk a little bit about the weathering process. In our atmosphere, carbon dioxide combines with water vapor to produce carbonic acid. That carbonic acid comes down in rain slightly acidic. It hits rocks on the surface of the earth. It initiates chemical weathering. Those calcium-containing rocks and magnesium-containing rocks, as they weather, produce bicarbonate. That bicarbonate then is transported in rivers and streams to the ocean. And so what's happening every day for hundreds of millions of years is that we have a natural carbon dioxide pump where carbonic acid weathers rocks. Those rocks take that carbon in the form of bicarbonate and move it to the ocean. And that's moving about half a gigaton of carbon a year from the atmosphere and sequestering it in deep ocean. Now, it's not much because we're putting north of 11 gigatons of carbon back into the atmosphere every year. But what if we could take that half a gigaton a year and double it or quadruple it or quintuple it? Could that aid as a carbon reduction strategy? Well, it sounds kind of crazy, but let me try to convince you that it's not so crazy, and it may be a realistic piece of the solution. At the University of Illinois, with support from the Leverhulme Foundation, Lever Brothers Soaps of all people, we are putting crushed rock on the landscape. And this is a crushed basalt that is magnesium and calcium rich, and it's crushed to a fine powder. And that fineness, that increased surface area to volume ratio, greatly accelerates the weathering process, hence enhanced weathering. Now, two things to recognize here. This fine material, it's actually called fines at the mining site, is a waste material. So we're producing it in great abundance and it's piling up in areas where it is mined. The other thing is we have the machinery and practice to spread it on the landscape. We're currently spreading it on an agricultural landscape here at the University of Illinois, in Miscanthus and Maize, at a rate of about 15 tons per acre. That's the spreader putting it out on the landscape. And our early results are pretty fascinating. This material is increasing soil pH, so it's behaving almost like limestone that we typically put on agricultural fields to offset the acidification from fertilizer production. It's reducing nitrous oxide production from this landscape. And our early evidence is suggesting that it's increasing carbon storage in the landscape by 10 to 20%. So maybe this is going to be a piece in addition to improved management practices, better species mixes on the landscape. This might be a management tool that we can use going forward to help draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Now, before I end, I just want to say a word about technology. We are going to see in the next few years, we are seeing it now, we're going to see spectacular technological advances that greatly improve our agricultural systems. This image is just kind of mind-blowing. This is from a group with folks from UC Davis and elsewhere. This was published, I think, last year, maybe the year before. This is an image of mucilage on the aerial roots of corn, and this is a particular variety that they discovered in Mexico. And in that mucilage are diazotropic bacteria that fix atmospheric nitrogen. Now, corn is notoriously nitrogen demanding, and a corn ecosystem is very nitrogen leaky, hence N2O production to the atmosphere and nitrate losses to groundwater. Well, in this cultivar, this particular genotype, those diazotrophs, that nitrogen-fixing bacteria, is meeting up to half or more of the corn's annual nitrogen demand. So imagine if we could put this into our elite varieties and have nitrogen-fixing corn in the landscape. What a fantastic advance that would be. One of my dear colleagues here at the University of Illinois, Steve Long, who gave this lecture several years ago, and his colleagues had a startling discovery, something I never believed would have happened a few years ago. They were able to manipulate only 3 genes in tobacco. And by manipulating those 3 genes, they were able to increase yields by 15%. Now they're working very hard to translate that same genetic manipulation into food crops so that we can get that same boost in production in food crops. And just to put that in context for you, 15% is basically 9 years of corn breeding. So that they jump that corn, that tobacco plant 9 years, the equivalent of 9 years of breeding into the future. So we can expect technological advances in the future. I want to leave you with a few concluding thoughts. And I'm gonna heavily editorialize here, so but I'm allowed to. It's my talk. So one thought I want to leave you with is that we should think very differently about our commercial agricultural systems, our big scale agricultural systems. It's entirely possible to dramatically decrease greenhouse gas emissions from these systems and from our food production system, and to even use our agricultural systems to draw down atmospheric carbon dioxide, as you saw with that basalt experiment. Diversifying our agricultural systems, not just in species composition, getting more perennials on the landscape, but also in our management practices and changing our food preferences. They can go a really long way to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from our agricultural systems. While there is much important research to be done in species mixtures as well as management practices, the technological advances that I've talked about, and changing food production systems. All of those can go a long way to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But the big challenge is we already know a lot about how to improve agriculture from a climate perspective. And to me, the big challenge is educating our farming community, building trust with our farming community, and as a person who has spent over 30 years at a land-grant institution rebuilding our extension services so we can help farmers adopt technologies that will be climate friendly. And I guess the last thing I want to leave you with is I've pointed to agriculture as part of the solution as we go forward, and it is part of the solution. We shouldn't put this on the shoulders of agriculture. If we are really serious about the climate challenge, we've got to dramatically and rapidly decarbonize our economy and move to renewable sources of energy. So with that, I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you, and I'm going to turn off my monitor right now and turn it over to Dr. Rattan Lal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. DeLucia. You're actually turning it over to me. I'm Kathy Wotecki, the president of the Charles Valentine Riley Memorial Foundation, and I'd like to first say, Dr. DeLucia, thank you. That was a really informative and also provocative talk, and one I think that Charles Valentine Riley would have enjoyed hearing and probably would have also liked to participate in this discussion. For those of you who are in the audience, you heard a little bit about Charles Valentine Riley in Dr. Parik's opening comments, but for those of you who don't know about him, he was an entomologist. He was also an immigrant to the United States in the 1800s. His research really helped to found the research function within the US Department of Agriculture. And he also played an enormously important role in establishing the entomology collection at the Smithsonian Institution. So he had a very important role in the early days of agricultural science within the United States. This annual AAAS Riley Lecture is important in continuing his vision of enhancing agriculture through science. And as Riley's work was important to establishing biological control, your work, Dr. DeLucia, is important in stemming calamitous climate change, warming, through changes that we can be making to agricultural systems. So my job at this point in our program is to introduce the panel that's going to contribute their views of what food and agricultural systems can and should be doing now and in the future to determine how much contribution changes in agricultural production can make to reducing greenhouse gases produced from food production systems. So Dr. Rattan Lal is going to be the moderator for this section of the program. He is this year's World Food Prize laureate and also a distinguished professor at the Ohio State University. And he was recognized by the World Food Prize this year for his work in restorative agriculture and the important role that soils can play in sequestering carbon and mitigating climate change. And joining him will be Dr. Maya Almaraz, Dr. Marty Matlock, and Dr. Meredith Niles. And we made a point this year of getting a diverse panel from different parts of the United States, and it also at different points in their careers, recognizing that agriculture is very different in different parts of the US, and also that the decisions that we're making are going to have profound effects on the future generations. So it was important to include young career scientists. The panel discussion will go on for about 20 minutes. It is going to start with some lightning talks from our three panelists who will be introducing themselves at the beginning of their talk. So I'm not going to do any more of an introduction for them other than to say they're great and you're going to enjoy hearing from them. And then we're going to, after the moderated discussion among the panel and with Dr. DeLucia that Dr. Lal is going to manage, then I'm going to come back and moderate the Q&A from the audience. So some of you have already started entering questions into the Q&A. continue doing that during the panel discussion, and we'll have, after about 20 minutes of the panel discussion, we'll come back and we'll take all of the questions that we can from the Q&A. You can address your questions to Dr. DeLucia or to any of the panel members as the discussion goes by. So at this point, Dr. Lal, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Wataki. I would like to join you and congratulate Dr. DeLucia for an outstanding presentation. Excellent one. I also want to thank World Food Prize Foundation for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this very important event. Dr. DeLucia made some excellent comments. To quote him, he said, "We are not going to address climate change only by improving agriculture. We have to consider fossil fuel and decarbonize the economy." But he also said that perennial biofuel production, no-till agriculture, improved grazing, meat-based system, enhanced weathering. He showed a slide of basalt. He showed a slide which I was fascinated, nitrogen fixing corn, amongst many other things. So the question is that whether these possibility that agriculture can really bring net emission to zero, is that a realistic, or is this not possible? I think that is one question I would like to ask all of our three panelists, really beginning with Dr. Maya Alvarez, 1 minute only, followed by Dr. Marty Matlock, and then Meredith Niles. So Dr. Maya Alvarez, please, 1 minute. What is your belief? Do you think agriculture can bring net zero emission, or is this too optimistic?
Yes, I absolutely think agriculture can bring net negative emissions, at least for the food system, maybe not global emissions, but I think we can do that through a combination of technology and behavioral changes like dietary change. And in doing that, we can also create these benefits for crop production, soil health, as well as biodiversity and human health.
Oh, thank you very much. So that's very optimistic. Dr. Marty Matlock, what is your opinion?
I absolutely agree with Maya that it's possible. We have on the land opportunities that are amazing and that Evan described: soil sequestration, alternatives to nitrogen fertilization, nitrogen use efficiency, reduction of erosion. All of those are critical for on the land systems. We do not yet have a good sense for how to put carbon in the soil for long term, over 100 years, but we have a history of that in our in our native prairies. And so there's an opportunity for exploring and building on alternative rotation systems beyond corn and soybean, including clover and oats as a 3-year rotation. Our friends in Iowa are exploring that very closely. But I will tell you, as long as we throw away 40% of our food after the consumer buys it, it really doesn't matter.
Oh, thank you for indicating the importance of saving food rather than wasting, in addition to the other practices, which I really appreciate. Dr. Meredith Niles, what is your views?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Lal. I would agree with my panelist, and I would also argue, as much of my work focuses on, we really have to think about the human behavior components of this question. And so I certainly think that there's huge potential and opportunity to change practices in agriculture and to change our consumption patterns, but we have to involve people and policy in those decisions in order to move the needle on some of these things. And so I would argue that I think that agriculture and food system emissions can absolutely contribute to achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions, but not on its own, and certainly not without considering people and policy as part of that equation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Dr. Lal, I'd like to interject.
Yes.
I made a mistake. I was supposed to have the flash talks go next and then lead into your panel discussion. So if I might interject, it might be worthwhile at this point
Absolutely.
to start the flash talks and kind of set that up.
Okay.
And also as a way for the panelists to introduce themselves. So I apologize, that was my mistake, but I think the flash talks will really help to kind of set up the rest of the discussion.
All right, thank you.
Hi, my name is Maya Almaraz, and I manage the Working Lands Innovation Center at UC Davis. My research focuses on combating climate change, and I most often examine this topic through the lens of food systems. The food system currently contributes about a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere. However, because agricultural landscapes are highly managed, they're uniquely poised to turn from a carbon source to a carbon sink on relatively short timescales through changes in production, consumption, and waste management. I explore climate mitigation strategies through both empirical tests of novel agricultural technologies in agroecosystems, and by using data science techniques that allow us to scale up the adoption of agricultural technologies, as well as changes in consumer behavior as it relates to diet. Our research shows that the global scaled agricultural technologies combined with dietary change offers a promising pathway for generating negative emissions for the food system. At the Working Lands Innovation Center, we're testing the carbon sequestration potential of agricultural technologies by performing the largest field study of soil amendments to date. Our goal is to develop practices that catalyze negative carbon emissions while also creating co-benefits for crop production, the economy, and human well-being. By creating scientific models that work hand in hand with human networks, we can develop and scale climate-smart food systems that can remove carbon from the atmosphere. Thank you very much, and I look forward to being a participant in this panel.
Hello, I'm Dr. Marty Matlock, Professor of Biological and Agricultural Engineering at the University of Arkansas. I'm also Executive Director of the University of Arkansas Resiliency Center. We know that we face a number of challenges over the next 50 years as humanity expands and as our resource base contracts. We also understand that the impacts that we're having on our ecosystem are exacerbating many of the interconnected problems we face. The tensions between solving these problems is real. We have to make choices. We have to decide what to do today in order to make humans prosperous today, and what we do tomorrow in order to ensure that prosperity tomorrow, and how do we not deteriorate that prosperity in the future. We also understand that agriculture is the most extensive of human activities. We cannot restore the balance of carbon in the atmosphere, in the geosphere, in the biosphere without agriculture being involved. But who gets to decide? That's a foundational question in civil society. We believe stakeholders, interested and affected parties, should have a say in how we address these tensions and we balance the problems we're facing. Field to Market, the Alliance for Sustainable Agriculture, is one of the largest multi-stakeholder initiatives in the world focusing on row crop agriculture. We have over 100 members in Field to Market. It's about 15 years old as an organization, from across the supply chain, from producers all the way through the consumers, as well as conservation organizations, NGOs, as well as universities and government organizations, to try to answer the question about how we make things better. What are we trying to make better? We want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's why we're here today. Soil loss is connected. Energy use, water use, land use. Those are our primary key performance indicators for agriculture in the US for now, for row crops. But we're looking also at water quality, nutrient use efficiency, and habitat and biodiversity as more integrative indicators across environmental issues. We've been able to implement these key performance indicators across virtually every sector of production agriculture in the US, including animal agriculture. That's been one of the great success stories over the last 15 years, this sort of convergence of understanding. And we're also benchmarking, measuring, setting goals for improvement across all of these. We can see over the last 20 years in soybeans, for example, using a moving average, you can see that we've improved greenhouse gas emissions, we've improved efficiency, reduced soil erosion, and we've also increased energy use efficiency. That's the way we get better. Wendell Berry said it best. It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work. And when we no longer know which way to go, we've begun our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeding stream is the one that sinks. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, and congratulations to Dr. DeLucia for his winning of this award. I'm Dr. Meredith Niles, Assistant Professor in Food Policy and Systems at the University of Vermont, and I'm going to focus a little bit on the human dimensions of food systems emissions. So collectively, the individual decisions that we all make significantly add up to climate impacts, and this is certainly true in food systems and agriculture as well. Across the food system, we have human emissions ranging from production to transformation and distribution, consumption, and waste. And people are embedded across all of these areas to make decisions that collectively have a climate impact. So today I'm going to focus a little bit on some of the production behaviors and consumption behaviors and human dimensions that we should consider as we think about this issue. On the supply side, there's a lot of factors that have been shown to affect farmer decisions as it relates to climate change mitigation. So climate change belief is important, but overwhelmingly research is now showing that the majority of farmers believe in climate change. And actually in some places, like Puerto Rico, a huge percent of farmers believe in climate change. So climate change belief may not be as important anymore as it used to be in driving mitigation decisions. Networks are another really important factor. Farmers most trust other farmers, industry, and farm groups for climate information that could affect how they make on-farm decisions. It's also important that farmers think other farmers support policies in order to move towards climate mitigation or other kinds of environmental conservation. Fostering capacity for farmers is also critical to help them make mitigation decisions. These kinds of capacities range from financial to technical, as well as institutional capacities. And in research we've conducted, we've shown that farmers' own perceived capacity to change practices is a consistent predictor of their actual and intended adoption of mitigation practices. And finally, money and politics. Economics are definitely important, and farmers need to know that these decisions may be profitable or help them at least break even. But also how policies are designed and regulations are designed is important to attract or deter farmers from these practices. Farmers are very concerned about regulation, and the majority of farmers we've surveyed in California, for example, aren't interested in government incentive programs for mitigation. So are there other potential leaders in the agriculture space that might play a role in this as well? Thinking about the demand side, there's certainly consumer decisions and human dimensions to think about with regards to food system emissions as well. So first of all, moderate shifts in diets seem to be what most consumers would be willing to support. Larger shifts towards entirely new kinds of diets are less supported by most consumers. It's also important to recognize that there are potentially some trade-offs as we think about sustainable diets, that not all diets or not all foods are going to have both greenhouse gas emission benefits and benefits in other areas like water or food waste, for example. It's also useful to think about human dimensions when you think about wishful thinking. So people take shortcuts and often hope for the best. For example, diners who knew their food was going to be composted in one study as compared to when it was going to go to a landfill were much more likely to waste food. So making sure that people understand the full impact of their decisions could be really important. There's also aspects of humility here. Social science tells us that people tend to overestimate their own abilities. So for example, 70% of Americans think they waste less food than an average American, and 82% of California farmers we surveyed think they use less water than average California farmers. So how can we help people understand how they compare to others in their environmental and other consumer choices? And finally, sometimes we don't need to tell people to change their behavior. There's a lot of new technologies as well as other behavioral economic interventions like nudges that might help people make decisions towards healthier options or options with less environmental impact. So congratulations to Dr. DeLucia. I look forward to talking about the human dimensions of this issue in our panel. And thank you for the opportunity to present today.
Dr. Wataki.
So Dr. Lal,
Yes.
it's now the panel is yours.
Thank you so much. I thought you had planned that way because this intervention was just I'm very impressed by all three panelists, what they did. And I was wondering at this point, just deviate a little bit from what we are planning, ask our honoree, Dr. DeLucia, what is his reaction to this excellent presentation by different panelists? Do you have any comments that panelists can respond to?
Well, not really one that we can respond to, but I know just enough about the economics and incentive systems that farmers deal with every day, how they get their loans. Farmers are getting massive loans this time of year to buy seed for next year, to put down chemicals for next year. Our machinery for harvesting crops are all geared toward the corn bean rotation system. So I know just enough about this to be dangerous. And from my perspective, to get any change, we know a lot about how to improve practices in terms of cultivation techniques, in terms of species choices. We know a lot about that. But how do you get folks to change? And, Meredith talked a lot about the culture of farming and the relationships in farming, that very important human dimension. But boy, it goes way back. It goes back to the system of government subsidies, the banking system. This is the part that really scares me, because I don't know, it's kind of out of control for me. But we've got to start making changes in that arena, and then building in incentive systems that are very important: cultural, social, and economic incentive systems.
Thank you. Meredith, maybe I could come back from what Dr. DeLucia just said. How do you change socioeconomic or incentive systems? Do you have any very quick response to that comment?
Well, how long is our panel? Well, I would completely agree with Dr. DeLucia to start. First of all, I mean, the human behavior components of this, we can't simply ask individuals collectively to change their behavior and expect it to happen. It's not happening. More information is not helping. And so we absolutely have to put in place policy structures, financial structures, lending structures, as you mentioned, Dr. DeLucia, that would move the needle on some of these things. And I know that the president of AAAS brought this up earlier, and I'd like to highlight the Ag Climate Alliance that came out this week, which is an interesting and excellent example, I think, of opportunities to move the needle on policy. So the Farm Bureau and other farm groups joining together with with the Nature Conservancy and other environmental groups, they make a number of policy recommendations, including looking at things like our subsidy systems as well as our crop insurance systems that underlie a lot of the decisions that farmers, quite frankly, don't get to make on their own. They're driven by a policy system that forces them into decisions because of how our policy and economic systems are structured. So I completely agree that that should be part of the conversation. Absolutely.
Thank you, Meredith. Maya, what is your response? Do you think the possibility that agriculture can bring about zero emission, is this over optimistic? What is it? Why are we held back if that was the possibility?
Yeah, I think that is absolutely a possibility. We have a lot of really good science saying that is an option. I think one of the things that is sort of continues to be a barrier is the more like the harder questions, the social science, the policy questions, the how do you get distribution networks in place that are economically optimal. So we really need to sort of work on this translational piece of the science of getting these theoretical frameworks into action. And I would say, on commenting on their discussion on change, I agree, change is difficult to achieve. And so one thing we're finding is we did a study looking at how you change diets. And diet is really hard to change, right? We've all tried to lose weight. It's really difficult. But what we found is that you sort of actually have to work top down. So we're looking at government partnerships with private industry to sort of change the story, change the culture, change the perception of these different practices, and that can really have a big impact.
Thank you. Marty, I was very impressed with your pen, which I believe is Sustainable Development Goals, and you even talked about Sustainable Development Goals. Can agriculture really make a difference in achieving Sustainable Development Goals by 2030? And if so, why agriculture and soil are not specifically mentioned in any of those 17 goals? Where is the problem? Is it the education of those who write them? Is it the lack of communication between scientists and the policymakers? Why is it that agriculture, even though it's such a low-hanging fruit, nobody actually talks about it at that level?
You know this better than I, Rattan, that since the 1950s, because of the success of modern agricultural practices, humanity, by and large, is no longer hungry. Now, we still have 840 to 860 million of our brothers and sisters who are chronically malnourished, but it is not 50% of humanity like it was in 1950. Because of our success, we are taken for granted. Agriculture can produce enough food for humanity today, and probably for 10 billion people in 40 years. We get another 3 billion brothers and sisters coming to dinner in the next 40 years. We better set a plate at the table for them. So that's the challenge, is that that the production capacity of agriculture is presumed to be capable of meeting those needs. That's an untested question, and unfortunately, we'll be testing that question all too soon. What I suggest is that while the 17 Sustainable Development Goals aren't hierarchical, they're not written in a way they're not listed in a way that is hierarchical. We understand that water and food are the two first needs of humanity, and that ending hunger is a key Sustainable Development Goal. So underlying all of the other, life on the land, human prosperity, equity for humans, is this notion of availability of food. 7.25 billion humans on the planet today means we have to capture 7.25 billion kilograms of phytochemical energy every day, process it and distribute it every day in order to meet the food needs, the caloric needs of our brothers and sisters. That's what we have to do every day. We're going to have to do that times another quarter, 10 billion in 30 to 40 years, every day. A day without food is not a pleasant day for humanity. These are our challenges. They are immediate, they're real, and they will undermine all other of our sustainability development goals if we do not achieve them.
Marty, thank you so much. That was an excellent overview of the situation. And I believe we really have time for one more question. And I'm going to take from where you left. I think the famine in the world is a man-made problem. We already produce enough food that we could feed not only the present population, but also population by 2050. The question is the way we look at it and the way rest of the world looks at it. For example, COP21 in Paris had adopted cattle per mill resolution. The COP22 in Marrakesh had adopted AAA, adapting African agriculture. Last year, COP adopted this PLACA, Platform on Climate Action in Agriculture. We in the US are not talking about it. So what's the difference between why we are so different than the rest of the world is thinking? And I'm going best to Maya. Could you please come back to answer that question? And I'm going to go from there to Meredith and then back to Marty. 1 minute each.
That's a great point. I think that the issues that we face and the way that we approach them really differs geographically. So in some regions, we have to worry about just people getting food on their plates. A lot of those regions are not high emitting areas. In other regions like the US, we are emitting a lot of emissions and doing this very large scale agricultural system. So, and we have an issue of sort of over nutrition at this point that can have negative health impacts. So addressing this, I think a lot of the studies that we've seen so far tend to look globally. And one thing we could use is some downscaling of those to see how to address this in different regions. I think one of the beauties of working in agricultural systems is that they are highly managed, so they can be adaptive relatively quickly when we're looking at large scale agriculture. When we're working on smallholder farms, that's a little bit different. So definitely finding more regionally specific interventions and discussions will be important in the future.
Thank you, Maya. And Meredith, your response, please. How do we think differently than the rest of the world?
An excellent question. Certainly, our policies in this country have not been forward-thinking on climate change for some time. And I think there's opportunity to change that. And certainly the agricultural industry is playing a role now in making sure that climate's on the table. And I think that's really critical. We have a lot of abundance in this country and not a lot of need. Although since I also do work on food security, I would argue that there are plenty of people suffering in this country as well. And so I think one of the things that we need to do as we think about working and engaging with the international community is acknowledge that the solutions cannot look the same in all places. We simply cannot expect the same dietary shifts in this low-income countries that we might need to see here in the United States. And we should acknowledge that 1 billion people globally rely on livestock for their livelihoods. And so there's huge implications for those issues across the globe. And it suggests, as Maya said, that we need more regional studies and studies and policy implications that are relevant to very different contexts across the globe.
Thank you, Marty. The several things are happening globally, especially in the UN Climate Summit. How can we motivate our management, our policymakers to follow what is happening elsewhere?
Oh, goodness. We have to recognize that everything is connected, that our prosperity, our common prosperity across humanity is connected to all of these elements: production of food and resources from the land, the ability to actually achieve a higher level of engagement with society through education and through economic expansion. All of those things are deeply connected. Food security is where it begins. 40% of Arkansans, where I live, are food insecure today. Most of those are children, and we are an agricultural state. Food security is not a resolved issue in the United States. It's just an ignored issue. Globally, as Paul Collier said in The Bottom Billion so eloquently, globally, it's about creating opportunity so that people can expand themselves. Now, I want to make it clear that Norman Borlaug, my friend and mentor, said that prosperity comes from food, from the land first. And I want to make it clear that Aldo Leopold, the father of the modern conservation movement, said we could little worry about these things wild until we no longer had to worry about where our breakfast came from. These are interconnected and they are critical. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I especially like your comment about the food security. I must say that when we talk about food security, we are not only talking about somebody far away in the farthest corner of the world. 40 million people in the US are food secure. 1.7 million in Ohio are food secure. 500,000 children below 5 in Ohio are food insecure. Even when one child goes to bed hungry, that's one too many. Not acceptable. I think that's a part that and it's sometimes an issue which is socioeconomic and policy as much as it's biophysical. Dr. Butecki, I think there might be some questions from the audience that our panelists could really address appropriately at this time.
Certainly, Dr. Lal, and there are a ton of questions from the audience. So we'll start off with one that relates to the profitability of corn and soybean farms in the Midwest. The question is, conventional row crop-based family farms in the Midwest are often borderline profitable depending on the year, and can more regenerative farming systems be both environmentally sustainable and economically sustainable as well? And what's the evidence base that we have?
Can the panelists please take a quick response to that? Meredith, we can begin with you.
It looks like Dr. DeLucia had his hand up. I'll let him step in as our honoree.
So,
Good.
yeah, I wake up every morning and I listen about puts and futures prices, and I get my farm report every morning. You're absolutely right. When we were, particularly in the last year, when we were in our economic battle with China, exports of beans were really hit hard. Farmers here felt that. But, our farming community is very tied to federal subsidies. And so I'm talking big farms here, typical farm in Illinois, Ohio, Iowa, well north of 1,000 acres, big farms. They're very tied to federal support structures. And, that to me, This is why it's so much a policy decision, because those same federal support structures could be used to incentivize other types of farming practices that were more regenerative, more sustainable economically, and also more sustainable from an environmental perspective. So I think a lot of it goes back into how we value the systems that we're producing.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. I think you raised the question of subsidy. I would like to ask panelists to take that point. What do you think is better, subsidy or payment for ecosystem services? Who would like to take? Maya, would you like to begin with it? And then we'll come back to Meredith in that sequence. Maya, Marty, and Meredith.
I think it would be great if we had some sort of payment system where we have a federally sponsored carbon program that can provide economic benefits to farmers who employ these practices. Another thing we're doing with a lack of that is to try to find interventions that have monetary benefits for farmers. So applying soil amendments could increase yields or increase water holding capacity to reduce the amount of irrigation that's needed. So trying to find these co-benefits prior to having a widespread carbon program is something that we're working on currently.
Thank you. Marty, what do you think? Subsidy versus payment for ecosystem services?
I think Maya hit it on the head. I will let Maya have that word because she's the most authoritative with her organization on this issue.
Thank you. Meredith?
Yeah, I would just argue, I think we have to think broadly about what we call a subsidy. So we have a lot of conservation practices currently that are considered subsidies, payment for ecosystem services through federal programs like EQIP or other NRCS programs. So it's really about shifting subsidies, I think, in a lot of the cases. The commodity subsidies that we have currently are usually price protections or crop insurance subsidies. We could certainly tie our crop insurance program to climate change adaptation and to other conservation practices that would improve the opportunity for farmers to get a better premium if they were implementing certain types of practices, for example. So I think I don't want us to not talk about subsidies because ultimately I think payment for ecosystem services are a form of subsidies. It's just thinking about how we redistribute subsidies to create those optimal situations for farmers. And, I would argue this year it's estimated that on average 30% of farm income will be coming from subsidies because of the COVID-19 subsidies as well. So we're in a moment to reimagine our food system. We've gone through a horrible situation, but it's also a moment of opportunity to really think about what we want our food system to look like moving forward, how it's failed so far in this moment of the pandemic, and what opportunities we have looking to the next farm bill to redistribute those policies and those subsidy systems.
Thank you. Dr. Verteke, back, you had tons of questions, so maybe.
I do.
Leave that one.
We have a good 8 or 10 questions that deal with trade-offs. In the corn soy system, no-till, cover crops, bringing more crops into production, into the rotation. So also some of the soil amendments that were you discussed, Dr. DeLucia, if they were introduced into the environment, what are the trade-offs with them? They do have positives with respect to the carbon sequestration, but there might be some negatives as well. And also trade-offs within our own production system where trade plays a very important role in the economics of the corn soy system. So could you reflect a bit, Dr. DeLucia, on those trade-offs? And it would be also interesting to hear from the panel about, there's some benefits, there's some costs.
Yeah, and I didn't talk about this at all, but of course, at the heart of all of the alternative practices that I was talking about is a proper life cycle assessment, which is an economic tool where we put everything on a carbon equivalency and we say, okay, we know that the landscape is sopping up carbon, but at what cost? So that rock material, you've got to truck that rock material or put it on a train to move it cross country. So at the end of the day, are you doing more harm than good? And of course, there are rebound effects. There are indirect land use change effects that all have to be considered when we're doing this. I will say that the carbon emissions from farming practices from fossil fuel consumption by vehicles is a very small piece of the pie. Now, that's not true of the carbon that goes into producing nitrogenous fertilizers. So offsetting the transportation costs tends to be a smaller piece of the pie. But we do have the tools for thinking about how to do the math, and that's life cycle assessment. And with some of the approaches I'm talking about today, that has been done or is underway.
Maya, I know some of your work has looked at these.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of research being done that can say we have strong evidence to support the idea that some of these soil amendments and other practices can sequester carbon in soils. I think less research has been done on the impacts, the potentially unforeseen consequences of some of these practices. So I think more research in that area would definitely be important right before you expand any sort of practice. You want to make sure it's going to be safe for everybody. I would also say that some of the arguments against soil carbon sequestration are the uncertainties that are involved. But we know that we can sequester carbon in soils, we can do it at fairly high levels, and that this can be done on relatively short timescales. So this can almost act as sort of a gap to reduce emissions, reduce atmospheric carbon while we work on decarbonizing our energy sector.
Another question that has come in relates to how much changing meat consumption, reducing meat consumption in those high consuming countries like the United States would make in reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Yes, Marty.
All right, I didn't know it. So I will say fundamentally that that we should be concerned about our diet composition for health reasons based upon our age, demographics, activities, etc., not based upon its externalities like greenhouse gas emissions, because the impact of those are relatively nominal compared to overall other issues. I also, and I think Meredith made this point very clearly, this sort of vilification of meat of animal proteins, dairy included, as a part of an advocacy for greenhouse gas reduction is misplaced, because so many of our brothers and sisters who are less well off than we are depend upon animal agriculture for sustenance. In many parts of the world, the only thing women can own are livestock. So this vilification of animal agriculture is a distraction. It's a distraction. And the other issue is, if we took all the meat off the planet today, off of our plate today, all the meat off our plate today, Evan, I think that would reduce total greenhouse gas emissions by 12 to 14%, 12 to 14%. And that's going to be the sort of dramatic system-wide change that's the most dramatic imaginable, and it would barely move the needle. We would still have 86% of greenhouse gas emissions as they are. I think we're barking up the wrong tree with meat. I think it's a conflation of other agendas that are driving this discussion.
Meredith, do you want to add?
Sure, I'll respond. I know Dr. Almaraz has done some work on this as well. So I agree that we should be looking at solutions that are health focused. And indeed, in many places, people are indulging too much in meat that have, negative health outcomes as well. And so a lot of the research does suggest that, there is alignment between what healthy diets might look like and what more sustainable diets might look like. I would also suggest that it's possible to achieve those outcomes without eliminating any food groups based on the best available research that we have. But I certainly think it is the case that in some places, people could re-explore their diets and shift those diets in certain directions. what I agree with Dr. Matlock on is that we should absolutely not be having these blanket statements that the entire country or entire world should eliminate animal protein, because that would have significant impacts on nutrition. It would also have significant impacts on livelihoods. So it needs to be a more nuanced conversation, not a blanket statement. And I would also suggest in that conversation that we fundamentally have to involve livestock producers in these conversations. These are people that are multi-generation people, and their families rely on these systems, and it has huge ripple effects across the world if we start to have serious conversations about that. So farmers should be at the forefront of those conversations as well.
And one final question for the panel relates to the applications of technology through plant breeding, biotechnology, to improving tree species for carbon capture. I'd like to broaden that question because Dr. DeLucia, you referred to this intriguing finding of a corn variety which has capabilities of nitrogen fixation. Are there ways through breeding to either introduce that or perennialization into annual crops? So, over the long term, can we breed ourselves out of, or through the applications of biotechnology, greatly improve the carbon sequestration in soils, as well as reduce our need for nitrogen fertilizers?
I think, as I mentioned at the end of my presentation, technology is going to take us a long way. But at the end of the day, this whole conversation needs to really revolve around elimination of carbon-based sources of fossil fuels. So I just want to reiterate that we're asking too much of our agricultural systems to feed an ever-growing human population, to provide nutrition, to do it sustainably, and to solve the world's climate challenges. That's too big a lift for agricultural systems. We've got to wean ourselves from fossil fuels. Yes, technology is going to play a very important role. It's continuing to play a role. As I mentioned, great increases in yield through genetic manipulation, reduced nitrogen inputs and herbicide inputs through BT, historic changes we've seen in our agricultural system. It's going to be very interesting to see how we balance this. In our current agricultural systems, we're talking about herbaceous plants, and we're talking about soil carbon sequestration. And under prairie, of course, which was here for 14,000 years, we built up huge carbon stores in the Midwest. One nice thing about that is that carbon is below ground. And so if you continue with positive and productive management practices, you can keep that carbon below ground even while harvesting the above ground. Forests are going to play a very important role in carbon storage. Afforestation is critical in terms of reducing carbon reduction strategy. Remember that carbon is stored only until the next forest fire. And so we do have to think about maintenance of coverage on the landscape in terms of, there really isn't any carbon storage. It's carbon residence time and how long you can keep it out of the atmosphere. So that's the game we're playing. But technology is going to play an important role. But at the end of the day, we got to decarbonize.
And on that note, I have to bring this to a close, but it was a good, a good summary, Dr. DeLucia. Congratulations to you, a wonderful lecture. Thank you to all of our panelists for their participation in this year's Riley Lecture. And on this closing slide, there's some contact information that if you want to follow up with folks at AAAS, and also the lecture will be posted on the AAAS website, so both the lecture and the discussion. So thank you all for participating in this year's AAAS Riley Lecture. Congratulations again, Dr. DeLucia, and please join us next year. We don't have the date, we don't have the topic for the lecture, but it will be advertised, and we hope you all can join us next year. Thank you.